many of the relationship challenges and tensions I come across in Christian ministry are come about because people don't have a suitable understanding of what it means to judge or to not judge. And perhaps you've heard the term, oh, the Bible says do not judge. And so people like to sprout that off. The Bible says do not judge. But the Bible doesn't say do not judge. The Bible tells us who to judge. And I'm indebted to Pastor Andrew Gray at C3 Mount Annan. He has taught this teaching he calls judgments beyond jurisdictions. And I've used that in many settings since he first taught that. And it fits very well. And it's important, a lesson for us as believers to understand. If you're going to know how to relate to other people effectively in this world, then it's important that you know what are the jurisdictions that you have, what judgments you can and can't make in order to be able to live at peace with those around you. How it plays out in our lives, it has consultations. It has connotations playing out in all areas of our life, including our family, our work life, our church life. It all comes down to, are we operating and making judgments effectively within the jurisdiction that we are given? So let's talk about family, for instance. If let's suppose my children were to say, well, we don't care what you say, we're doing it our way. Well, you and I would know that that is unacceptable. Why is that unacceptable? Because within the context of my family, I'm a judge. I have a right, and not just a right, a responsibility to bring judgment and judge actions in order that that family unit can function correctly. If I usurp my authority and choose not to judge and just say to my kids, hey, you do whatever, well, that leads to disruption and dysfunction within the family. So it's important that I understand that in that context, I have the right to judge. But I don't have the right to judge somebody else's family. I don't have the right to judge somebody else's children. They are not within my family. So let's use the example of a judge, for instance. Let's suppose that a judge in the Supreme Court wants to go and pronounce judgment in the High Court, for instance. Now, they may be right. They might actually be more experienced than the person in the High Court, theoretically, but that court is not under their jurisdiction. So they are basically have no authority to pronounce judgment within that court. And they have to judge within their jurisdiction. Same in family life. So it's not my responsibility to tell your children how to raise your children. That's entirely up to you. You need to do that. I need to do it for my family. And that is staying within jurisdiction. And I've seen this where parents have tried and discipline and change other kids and tell them they should be behaving a certain way. And sometimes it's because those other kids are actually mistreating their kids. If you want to know how to deal with that, just look at my session on how to handle unfair treatment that I've got in this FAQ section, because that will help you to understand the effective way to deal with that. Within the confines of the church, this plays out too. Oftentimes, tension and disruption is caused in the church because people make judgments beyond their jurisdiction. If you're not part of the worship team, then you have no jurisdiction telling the worship team how to lead their worship. If you're not part of the hosting team, you have no jurisdiction telling them whether they're shaking hands and doing it appropriately or not. There is structure set up within the church family, just like within the natural family, the biological family. And if you have an issue, you should follow the chain of authority. So, for instance, first thing you need to ask yourself is this actually any of my jurisdiction? And if it isn't, then you need to ask yourself, is it worth dealing with? Is it worth fighting over? Some things, many things, are not worth fighting over. You might feel strongly about them, but in the grand scheme of things, you go, it's better to maintain the unity of the Spirit, like the Bible says, through the bond of peace, rather than to have my say. But if you do feel that it is something that you feel very strongly about and need to deal with, then you don't just go anywhere, you go up. You go up in the chain of authority to the person above you who can deal with that situation. It might be your pastor, it might be your leader, team leader, and then you submit it to them. Now, what they do with it is up to them. Once you've submitted it, you have done your part. There's nothing else you need to do. You can submit it and say, well, God, I'm not accountable for this behavior anymore. And generally speaking, whether they act on it or not, that's not your responsibility. You've done your part. But let's suppose that you really do feel it's a major issue. There are sticking points where you don't feel. Maybe you've gone through the chain of authority and you've gotten to the senior pastor or a leader in an organization, which applies just as well there, and you just feel this is a major sticking point. It may be a moral issue. It may be something you feel so emphatic about that you can't deal with. Well, at that point, through after discussion and effort has been made to bring reconciliation and understanding, if you feel that you can't serve within that family, you can't live within that family context or within that organization, then it's time to move on. But when you do move on, you don't move on bitter, you don't move on twisted, you don't move on taking people with you. You just simply say, look, I can't fit in this environment. I'm going to move on and find a family where I can fit, but then you don't get embittered about it. Just give it to God and be faithful and say, well, we're just different. That's okay. You want to go your way, you can go your way, we'll go our way. So the last area where this plays out is how we judge unbelievers. And churches are notorious for judging unbelievers and not judging Christians. And the thing is, we need to understand, you have a look at 1 Corinthians 5, you'll see the Apostle Paul teaches on this very issue in 1 Corinthians 5. He makes it very clear to us. He says, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? God will judge those outside the church. I need to judge those inside the church. So when churches wave placards and flags and put people down because they're not ascribing to Christian values, we are outside of love. Andy Stanley says we are not leveraging love when we're reaching those people because they never signed up to live by our moral standard in the first place. So what right have we got to hold them accountable to something they never agreed to? Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus sees Zacchaeus up the tree and he doesn't try to correct all of Zacchaeus' sins and actions. He accepts him, and as he accepts him and hangs out with him and gets to know him and relates to him, Zacchaeus is convicted of his sin himself and he does something about it. So until a person becomes a believer and joins the family and says, I want to be part of this family, until that point, we have no right to judge them for their behavior. We shouldn't look down on them. In fact, we should be reaching them and loving them and accepting them. And as they feel accepted and loved and give their life to Jesus and say they want to be a follower of Jesus, then opens up a channel for you to have jurisdiction into their life. If you are counseling them or supporting them in some way, pastoring them, raising them in the faith, you can sit with them at that point and say, now that you're a believer, Jesus wants us to behave differently, and start to coach them in how to behave. But at that point, they're part of the family and you have the jurisdiction to do so. So don't make judgments outside of your jurisdiction, and you will find that the relationships around you will be far more comfortable.